At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, my mother went into cardiac arrest in a hospital 40 minutes from my apartment, and nobody called me until 9:15 that morning. I know the exact times because I checked my phone log later, the way I check everything later, carefully, after the fact, when the shaking has stopped and the facts are the only thing left standing. 6 hours and 28 minutes. That's how long my family knew before they decided I was worth telling. My brother was there by 3:30. My father by 4 o'clock. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years got a call at 5:45, just in case, my mother's sister said later, in case something needed doing. I needed doing. I have always been the one who does things. And yet the two people who had raised me, who had my number saved under Renata with a heart emoji I'm sure they never once looked at, let 6 hours pass in silence. I remember standing in that waiting room in the same jeans I'd pulled on in the dark, my hair still unbrushed, watching my brother sip a vending machine coffee like a man attending a mildly inconvenient meeting rather than the aftermath of our mother's heart stopping. I remember the specific, sour taste of adrenaline gone cold, the way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the way nobody in that room could quite meet my eyes when I asked, calmly, why it had taken so long for the phone to ring. Here is the twist, the one I didn't see coming even after everything else, my mother survived that night. And 3 weeks later, going through a box of my late grandmother's letters looking for nothing in particular, I found a phone number written in the corner of an old birthday card, a number I recognized immediately, because it had once belonged to a stranger, then belonged to me, and would go on, before this was over, to unravel every lie my family had told itself for 30 years. Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth about the families that underestimated them. If stories about betrayal, backbone, and starting over speak to you, drop a comment below and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when the quiet one stops staying quiet. My name is Renata Voss, and I was the second child, which in my family was a polite way of saying the spare. My brother Julian is 18 months older than me, and for as long as I can remember, our house ran on a kind of math I only understood as an adult: whatever Julian needed, the family found. Whatever I needed, I usually found myself. I don't say this to sound bitter, though I suppose I am allowed to be. I say it because specifics matter, and vague resentment is easy to dismiss while specific memories are not. When I was 9, I won the regional spelling bee, the actual regional one, not the school one, with a trophy taller than the one Julian got for making varsity soccer 2 years later. My mother put Julian's trophy on the mantel. Mine went on a shelf in the hallway, next to the guest bathroom, where the light didn't reach it. When I was 14, I saved $400 from babysitting to buy my first real bicycle, since the family bikes had always somehow ended up being Julian's to use first, mine to use when he's done. My father drove me to the store and then, in the parking lot, informed me the money would be better spent on Julian's driving lessons, since he'd be 16 soon and needed to learn. I rode a hand-me-down with a bent wheel for 2 more years. Julian got his license at 16 exactly. When I got into college, the first person in either side of our family to be accepted to a 4-year university with any kind of scholarship, my parents took out a loan to cover Julian's tuition at a school he'd chosen specifically because it was more expensive than mine, and told me, calmly, over dinner, that I'd need to take out my own loans, since "You're always so responsible, Ren, you'll figure it out." I did figure it out. I worked 2 jobs through school and graduated with honors and $11,000 of debt that took me until I was 29 to pay off. Julian's tuition was never mentioned as a loan. I only learned decades later it had, in fact, been one my parents were still quietly paying off themselves, one they never once asked Julian to help with. None of this, on its own, is a crisis. That's the trouble with a lifetime of small evidence, no single piece of it would hold up in court. It's not until you lay it all out, side by side, that you can see the pattern in the weave. There was a smaller moment, too, one I didn't think about for years until it resurfaced the way small things do, uninvited, at 3 in the morning. I was 11. Julian had a school project due, a diorama of the solar system, foam balls and toothpicks and glitter glue, and he'd left it until the night before, the way he left everything. My mother sat at the kitchen table with him until nearly midnight, holding the foam balls steady while he painted, praising every wobbly ring around his cardboard Saturn as if it belonged in a museum. I remember sitting on the stairs in my pajamas, watching through the banister, because I had a science fair project of my own due the same week, a study on which brand of paper towel absorbed the most water, methodical and slightly boring, exactly the kind of project a girl who already understood the value of a controlled variable would choose. I never asked for help with mine. I don't think it occurred to me that help was something you were allowed to ask for. I built it alone at the kitchen table on a different night, after everyone else had gone to bed, measuring water with a kitchen cup because we didn't own a proper beaker, and I won second place at school. Julian's diorama, glued together at midnight by two sets of hands, won nothing, and nobody in my family remembers that. I remember it perfectly. I think that's the difference between the child who is protected from consequence and the child who is quietly, invisibly, teaching herself how to survive it. The clothes were another quiet ledger. Julian got new sneakers every fall, a ritual as fixed as the school calendar itself, while I wore his outgrown jeans, cuffed, since he was taller, the extra fabric folded and safety pinned at the ankle through most of middle school. My mother called it practical. I believed her, mostly, because 8-year-olds believe most things they're told with confidence. It wasn't until I was much older, doing math I hadn't wanted to do, that I understood practical had only ever run in one direction. I left home at 22 and built a life 2 hours away, close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. I became an internal auditor for a regional insurance company, a job that suited me better than anyone in my family understood, because it rewarded exactly the trait they'd always treated as a character flaw, my refusal to accept a story until the numbers backed it up. My manager used to joke that I could smell an inconsistency the way other people smelled rain coming. I never told her that I'd had 30 years of practice smelling exactly one inconsistency, over and over, in a house I no longer lived in. I want you to remember that about me. It will matter later. The call came from my Aunt Deborah, not my father, not my mother, not Julian, at 9:15 a.m., her voice carefully arranged into something calm. "Your mom had a cardiac event last night," she said. "She's stable. You should come." "Last night," I repeated. "What time last night?" There was a pause I would come to think of, later, as the sound of someone deciding how much of the truth to give me. "Around 3, I think," she said. "It's been a long night for everyone." I drove the 40 minutes with my hands so tight on the wheel my knuckles went white, running the math the entire way. 3 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. 6 hours. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a dead phone, a chaotic ER, some understandable delay. When I got to the hospital, the waiting room told a different story. My father was in the corner, drinking coffee from a paper cup, looking tired but not frantic. My cousin was there, scrolling her phone. Julian was pacing by the window, but when he saw me, his first words were not, "Thank God you're here," or "I'm sorry it took so long." His first words were, "Oh good, now someone can sit with Dad so I can go get changed. I've been in these clothes since last night." I stood very still in the doorway of that waiting room and asked the question I already, somewhere, knew the answer to. Why didn't anyone call me until 9:15? My father didn't look up from his coffee. "We didn't want to worry you until we knew more. You called Deborah at 5:45. You called Julian at 3:30. You didn't want to worry me." "It happened fast, Ren," my mother's sister said from across the room. Nobody was thinking clearly. But I had done the math, and the math didn't support that. Deborah lived across town. Julian lived one town over. I was the closest, geographically, of everyone in that room except my father. I could have been there by 3:45 if someone had simply dialed my number. I found out 3 days later, from a nurse who mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew, that my mother had in fact asked for me, had, in a lucid moment around 4 a.m., asked where I was, and my father had told her, "She's on her way, don't worry," a comforting lie to a woman hooked up to a heart monitor, at a moment when the truth was that no one had called me at all. The nurse's name was Marisol, and she had no way of knowing what she'd just handed me. She said it gently, refilling my mother's water pitcher, the kind of offhand comment made by someone assuming she was simply confirming a fact everyone in the family already shared. "Your mom kept asking for you around 4, she said. Your dad told her you were on the way." She settled right down after that. It's sweet how much that reassured her. I said something non-committal, thanked her, and walked out of the room and down the hallway to the vending machines, where I stood very still in front of a display of chips I had no intention of buying, because I needed somewhere to stand that wasn't in view of my family while I processed what I'd just learned. My father had not simply failed to call me. He had actively told my mother, at her most vulnerable, that I was already on my way, a specific, deliberate lie, constructed on the spot, to smooth over the fact that no one had thought to include me at all. It would have taken him 10 seconds to actually call me. Instead, he'd spent those 10 seconds inventing a version of events where my absence didn't need explaining. I went back into the room an hour later and sat with my mother and said nothing about it, because she was recovering from a cardiac event and it was not the moment. But I filed it away with the precision I brought to every spreadsheet at work: date, time, exact words, source. I didn't yet know I was building a case. I only knew that some part of me, the auditor part, the part that had never once accepted a story it couldn't verify, had quietly opened a new file. That was the moment something in me went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. Not loud. Not tearful. Quiet the way a room goes quiet after a door closes for good. I did not confront anyone in that hospital. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the satisfying thing to do is scream in a waiting room, and that was never who I was going to be. Instead, I stayed for 11 days. I brought my mother soup. I filled her water pitcher. I sat with her at 2 a.m. when the monitors beeped in a rhythm I memorized without meaning to. I was, in every practical way, the daughter who showed up, even though I was the daughter who'd been left out. And on the 12th day, once she was stable and moved to a step-down unit and the danger had genuinely passed, I drove home, packed a single overnight bag, and left a note on my parents' kitchen counter, under the sugar bowl where my mother would find it when she made her evening tea. It said, "I love you. I'm glad you're okay. I need some time and I'll reach out when I'm ready. Please don't call." That was it. No accusations. No list of grievances. I had learned, over 30 years, that arguing with my family was like arguing with weather: loud, exhausting, and ultimately unable to change the forecast. So instead, I did the one thing none of them expected from the reliable daughter, the one who always figured it out, the one who always showed up. I stopped showing up. I turned my phone to silence family numbers, not blocked, just silent. I wanted to see who tried, and how many times, and I wanted a record of it. I moved into a short-term rental across town, told my job I needed 2 personal days, and let the quiet settle over me like something I'd been needing my whole life and never had the nerve to take. For the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody needed anything from me. I want to describe those 11 days honestly, because they weren't heroic and they weren't cinematic. Mostly, they were exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I sat in a vinyl recliner beside my mother's bed and watched daytime television with the sound low, and in between, I ran the numbers of my own life the way I ran numbers at work, not to punish myself, just to understand the shape of what I'd been living inside of. I counted the number of times, growing up, I'd been the one to drive myself to the emergency room, once for a broken wrist at 16, because both my parents were at Julian's regional soccer tournament 3 hours away and hadn't wanted to disrupt his game. I counted the number of graduations, promotions, and small victories that had gone unacknowledged, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a kind of practiced inattention, the inattention you give something you've already decided is stable and therefore doesn't need watching. I thought, too, about the note I would eventually leave, turning phrases over in my head during the long overnight hours, discarding the ones that sounded like accusations and keeping the ones that simply told the truth. I didn't want to write something that gave them an argument to have with me in my absence. I wanted to write something so plain it couldn't be misread, couldn't be turned into a story where I was the dramatic one and they were the reasonable ones. That, more than anything, is what 30 years in that family had taught me to fear, not conflict itself, but the particular talent my parents had for narrating any conflict into a version where their choices made sense and mine looked like an overreaction. On the 12th day, my mother was stable enough to be moved to a step-down unit, chatting with the nurses, asking Julian to bring her a certain brand of ginger ale from the vending machine 2 floors down. I watched him go, cheerful, useful, the way he'd always been useful, and I understood with total clarity that the machinery of my family would keep running exactly the way it always had unless something in it changed. I drove home that evening, packed one bag, and wrote the note I'd been composing in my head for 11 days, in far fewer words than I'd expected it to take. I wasn't entirely alone in the silence, and this is the part of the story I want to slow down on, because it's easy to talk about betrayal and forget to talk about the people who don't betray you. My coworker, Priya Anand, had sat 2 cubicles from me for 6 years. She was the kind of quietly observant person who noticed when your coffee order changed, or when you stopped eating lunch at your desk and started eating it in your car instead. The week after the hospital, she showed up at my new short-term rental with a grocery bag of things I hadn't asked for and desperately needed: real food, a phone charger because she'd noticed mine was held together with tape, a bottle of wine, and no questions. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said, setting the bag on my counter. "But I'm going to sit here for a while, if that's okay." She sat there for 3 hours and we didn't talk about my family once. We talked about a terrible movie she'd seen. We talked about nothing. It was the first time in 11 days I'd felt like a person instead of a function. The second person was my elderly neighbor, Halloran, a retired ICU nurse who lived 1 floor down and who I'd exchanged maybe a dozen sentences with over 3 years of living in that building. She caught me in the hallway looking, in her words, like a woman who hasn't slept since the Clinton administration, and invited me in for tea before I could even explain myself. Dot had spent 31 years working cardiac units. When I told her, haltingly, what had happened, the 6 hours, the lie told to my mother's face while she lay on a monitor, didn't flinch and didn't rush to defend my family the way well-meaning strangers sometimes do. "That's not confusion," she said, stirring her tea. "Confusion is forgetting to call the pharmacy. 6 hours is a decision. Somebody decided that, honey, even if nobody says it out loud." I didn't know it yet, but Dot would matter again, much later, in a way neither of us could have predicted that afternoon. Over the following weeks, a small rhythm formed between the 3 of us that I hadn't realized I'd been missing my whole life. Priya started leaving a second coffee on my desk without asking, the same order every time: oat milk, 1 sugar, because she'd apparently memorized it months before I ever needed the comfort of it. On Thursdays, Dot would knock twice on my door around 7, always with something small: a container of soup, a paperback she thought I'd like, once a single tomato from her balcony garden, because it was ready and you looked like you needed something that grew instead of something that got taken. Neither of them ever asked me to perform gratitude for it. Neither of them ever kept score. I remember one evening in particular, maybe 2 weeks after the note under the sugar bowl, when I finally let myself cry in front of someone for the first time since the hospital. It was Dot's kitchen, her chipped mug in my hands, and I told her, in pieces, about the bike with the bent wheel and the science fair and the diorama and the 6 hours. She listened without interrupting, the way I imagined she'd listen to 1,000 frightened family members outside 1,000 hospital rooms over 31 years, and when I finished, she didn't tell me it would be okay, which I appreciated more than I could say at the time. "You don't owe anyone your whole life just because they made half of you," she said instead. "Blood's not a debt. It's just biology. What you owe people is what they've actually earned." I didn't understand yet how literally that sentence would come to apply to my family, but I wrote it down anyway, in the Notes app on my phone, under a note titled simply D, which by the end of that year had grown to 11 entries long. 3 weeks after I left the note under the sugar bowl, I went back to my parents' house, not to reconcile, but because my mother had asked, through a single careful text, if I would help her sort through my grandmother's things. My grandmother, Ilsa, had passed the previous winter, and her boxes had sat in my parents' garage ever since, untouched, because nobody else in the family had the patience for old paperwork. I said yes. Partly because I loved my grandmother more uncomplicatedly than I loved almost anyone else in that family, and partly because, and I'll admit this now, I wanted an excuse to be in that house without having to make conversation with anyone but boxes. It was in the third box, wedged between a stack of expired coupons and a recipe card for a coffee cake I remembered from childhood, that I found the birthday card. It was addressed to my grandmother, from her brother, my great-uncle, a man named Halvard who I'd met exactly twice in my life and knew almost nothing about, except that the family spoke of him the way you speak of weather systems that pass through and cause damage. In the corner of the card, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a phone number, and beside it, one word, his. I stared at that number for a long moment before I understood why it looked familiar. It was, digit for digit except the last two, the number I had been assigned when I got my first cell phone at 19, a coincidence of area code and exchange, I assumed at first, until I looked closer and realized the match wasn't a coincidence at all. It was the exact same number, reissued to me 9 years after my great-uncle had apparently abandoned it. I hadn't thought about those calls in years, the strange, insistent calls I used to get in my early 20s, asking for a man named Hal, from banks and collection agencies and once, memorably, a lawyer's office. I'd always assumed, the way you assume most background noise, that it was some unrelated stranger's unpaid bills following an unlucky number around. I had blocked those callers one by one, the way you swat away flies, without ever wondering who they were actually looking for. I sat on the concrete floor of that garage for a long time, the birthday card in my lap, my knees pulled up against the cold seeping through my jeans, and let myself remember those calls in detail for the first time in years. I remembered the particular flatness in the voices of the collection agents, the way they'd ask for Hal with a kind of practiced weariness, as if they, too, had been chasing this man for so long that hope had long since drained out of the search. I remembered blocking numbers on 3 different phones across nearly a decade, updating a running list in the Notes app one still, to this day, keep out of habit. I remembered, once, a lawyer's office calling about a matter they described only as a joint obligation, and how I'd told them, honestly, that they had the wrong number, never once suspecting that the wrongness of the number was, in fact, a family matter. Now I was looking at proof, in my dead grandmother's handwriting, that the man they'd been looking for was family. I carried the card inside, set it on the kitchen table in front of my mother, and asked the only question I could manage. "Who is Hal?" I said. "And why does Grandma's handwriting say this number used to be his?" My mother went very pale, in the particular way people go pale when a question lands somewhere they've spent years making sure it couldn't reach. "That's my Uncle Hal," she said carefully. "My mother's brother. He wasn't a good man, Ren. We don't really talk about him." "I had his old phone number for almost a decade," I said. "I spent years fielding his creditors." "Nobody ever thought that was worth mentioning?" She didn't have an answer for me that day, not a real one, just a vague reassurance that it was complicated and before your time and not really relevant anymore. I let it go, that afternoon, because I could see she genuinely didn't know how to begin. But I didn't stop thinking about it, and 3 days later, going back through the same box for a second, more thorough look, I found the letter in the hymnal that would answer the question my mother couldn't. I didn't say anything to my mother that day. I finished sorting boxes, drove home, and sat with that birthday card for 4 days before I let myself ask the question underneath the question, why had nobody ever mentioned that Great-Uncle Hal had once had my phone number? The answer, when it finally came, arrived from an unlikely source, my grandmother herself, in a way, through a second letter I found tucked inside a hymnal in the same box, dated 11 years before her death, addressed to no one, the kind of letter you write because you need somewhere to put the truth and don't trust yourself to say it out loud. I want to be careful here, because I promised myself I wouldn't quote it word for word, out of some respect for the privacy of a woman who never intended for anyone but herself to read it. But the substance of it was this: my grandmother had known, for years, that her son-in-law, my father, had co-signed several loans with Hal in the early years of his marriage to my mother, loans that Hal had never intended to repay, loans that had quietly nearly bankrupted my parents before I was even born. My father had spent years scrambling to cover those debts in silence, terrified of the shame of it becoming known, and my grandmother believed, she wrote this plainly, in her looping, careful hand, that this fear was the reason my father had spent the rest of his life desperate to prove, through Julian, through visible success, through a golden-favored son, that the Voss family was not the kind of family that got taken advantage of. He needed a story where we were the family that succeeds, she wrote. And Renata, God love her, never needed the story fixed. She just was what she was. I think that's why it was always easier for him to love Julian louder. Julian was the proof. Renata was just true. I read that letter 4 times before I could set it down. My grandmother had never once, in her lifetime, hinted at any of this to me, not at holidays, not during the long afternoons I used to spend at her kitchen table doing homework while she cooked, not even in the last conscious conversation we ever had, 3 days before she died, when she'd held my hand and said only, "You were always the steady one, Renata. Don't let them make steady feel like a consolation prize." I had thought, at the time, it was just something kind to say to a granddaughter at a bedside. I understood now it had been the closest she ever let herself come to telling me the truth outright. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried for the first time since the hospital, not because it was sad, though it was, but because for the first time in my life, someone had put into words the exact shape of the thing I had always felt and never had proof of. I hadn't been loved less because I was less. I had been loved less because I hadn't been useful to a story my father was desperate to tell about himself. I thought about the word proof for a long time that night. Julian was the proof that the Voss family had recovered, had thrived, had produced a son who wore new sneakers every fall and got driving lessons at 16 and went to the expensive school. I had never been asked to be proof of anything. I had simply been asked to be quiet, competent, undemanding, the daughter who didn't complicate the narrative. For a moment, sitting on that floor, I felt almost sorry for Julian, for the exhausting, invisible job he'd been assigned since childhood, the job of being evidence in a case he never knew he was part of. And somewhere in a drawer, in an old cell phone contract from years ago, was the paper trail that would let me prove exactly how far that story had been built on debts nobody ever paid. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake running through everything I knew about phone contracts, county records, and public judgment filings, the unglamorous machinery of proof that had, for 6 years, been the actual substance of my working life, and by morning, before I'd even had coffee, I had opened a blank spreadsheet on my laptop and typed a single header across the first row, timeline. Here is where my job, the one my family had always treated as a slightly boring footnote at dinner parties, became the most useful skill I owned. I am an auditor. I do not panic when I find an inconsistency, I build a file. I spent the next 6 weeks, on my own time, doing exactly what I do at work every day, except this time, the ledger was my own family. I started with public records. The loan co-signature my grandmother's letter had referenced was findable, eventually, through an old county filing my father had never fully discharged, technically settled but only after nearly a decade of minimum payments that had drained my parents' savings during the exact years they told me there was no extra money for my school fees. I cross-referenced it against my own memory, the summer I was 12 when we suddenly stopped taking vacations, the year my mother went back to work just to help out a little, the birthday I was told, gently, that there wasn't money for a party that year, 3 months after Julian's very well-funded birthday party the previous fall. I found old phone records from the network that had first issued me that number, proof, dry and undeniable, that it had belonged to Halvard Reyes for 4 years before it was reassigned to me, and that during those 4 years, the number of collection calls associated with unpaid balances numbered in the dozens. I built a spreadsheet. I am not proud of how satisfying it was to build a spreadsheet about my own childhood, but I won't pretend otherwise, either. I named the file, half as a joke to myself and half because I needed the joke to survive the process, the waiting room file, for the room where 6 hours had taught me the truth I'd spent 30 years refusing to see clearly. The work itself was almost meditative, in the way tedious, careful things sometimes are. I'd come home from my actual job, the one I got paid for, and spend 2 or 3 hours most evenings on this second, unpaid audit, cross-referencing old bank statement summaries my mother had once, years ago, absent-mindedly left in a shared family cloud folder for tax purposes and never removed, matching dates against my own childhood memories, which I'd started keeping in a second tab of the same spreadsheet, labeled simply lived experience, so that the hard data and the felt experience could sit side by side and corroborate each other the way good evidence should. The summer we stopped taking vacations lined up, almost to the month, with a spike in minimum loan payments in my father's old statements. The year there was no extra money for my school fees lined up with a lump sum payment that had gone out of my parents' account 4 months earlier, one that, cross-referenced against the county filing, matched the exact amount of a settlement on the co-signed loan. I found myself, some nights, laughing quietly and a little bitterly at my own kitchen table, at the sheer mundanity of the proof. There was no smoking gun, no single dramatic document. There was only what there always is in real fraud, real family dysfunction, real long-buried shame, years of small, boring numbers that told a truth nobody had the courage to say out loud at the dinner table. I didn't go looking for Halvard himself. I found him anyway, 3 weeks in, through the simplest method possible. A mutual old contact of my grandmother's mentioned, offhand, that he'd resurfaced 2 towns over, working under a slightly altered version of his name, still, according to the county filings I could access through work, carrying 2 open judgments against him. For one evening, I considered driving out there. I even mapped the address. But Priya, when I mentioned it over dinner, asked me a single question that stopped me cold. What would you actually get from that conversation that you don't already have in your spreadsheet? I didn't have an answer. I closed the map and didn't open it again. He was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a family that had built 30 years of unequal love around a debt they were too ashamed to name. I finished the file on a Sunday night in April, 42 pages once I'd added summary tabs and a printed timeline, the fluorescent kitchen light humming overhead the way it always did when I worked too late. I printed 3 copies at the library instead of at home, some instinct telling me I wanted this particular act of preparation to happen on neutral ground, away from my own apartment, as if the document itself needed to begin its life somewhere that belonged to no one. I drove to my parents' house one more time. I did not want a scene in a kitchen. I had learned, in the 11 days after the hospital, that my family's kitchens were not neutral ground, they were stages, built for performances of normalcy, and I did not intend to give them one more performance. I called my mother and asked her to meet me, along with my father and Julian, at a small conference room I booked at the public library near their house, a room usually reserved for book clubs and tax prep volunteers, plain, fluorescent lit, entirely without history. I told her it was about Grandma Ilse's estate paperwork, which was, in its way, not even a lie. I spent the 2 days before the meeting doing something I don't think I'd ever done in relation to my family. I rehearsed. Not lines exactly, but boundaries. I called Priya and read her the opening sentence 4 times until it stopped shaking. She listened each time without interrupting, and on the 4th read, she said only, "That's it. That's the one. Don't add anything to soften it, you've softened enough things for them your whole life." I had tea with who listened to the whole plan and said only, "Good. Facts first. Feelings after, if there's room for them. Don't let anyone rush you into skipping to the feelings part before the facts have landed." She also told me something I've carried with me since, about the families of patients she used to watch fracture and reassemble in ICU waiting rooms over 3 decades. The ones who healed best, she said, weren't the ones who yelled the loudest or the ones who forgave the fastest. They were the ones who could say the true thing plainly and then just wait, without filling the silence for the other person. Most people don't know how to just wait. You do, Ren. Use that. I didn't sleep well the night before. I kept rehearsing not just what I'd say but what I'd do if my father simply refused to engage, if he stood up and left the room the way he had, once, during an argument when I was 17, slamming a door hard enough to rattle the windows. I made myself a plan for that possibility too. I would let him go, I decided, and finish the conversation with whoever stayed. I would not chase him down a hallway the way I once had, needing his approval more than I needed my own dignity. That was the version of myself I was finally, deliberately, leaving behind. I printed 3 copies of the waiting room file, one for each of them, not because I wanted them to read it in front of me, but because I wanted them each to have to hold it, to feel the weight of 30 years condensed into 42 pages, and know that I hadn't come to yell. I had come with evidence, the way I always had, the way they'd always underestimated. They were all seated when I walked in, my mother in the middle, my father to her left, Julian sprawled in a chair with the particular posture of a man who assumes any meeting called by his sister must be minor. I set the 3 folders on the table without preamble. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "I'm here to tell you what I found, and to tell you what I need going forward. You can respond however you want. I'm not going to argue with any of it. I just need you to hear it." My father's jaw tightened before I'd said a single accusatory word, which told me, more than anything, that some part of him had been waiting for this meeting for 30 years. "This is about the hospital," Julian said, not a question. "It's about the hospital," I agreed. "And it's about a phone number, and a man named Halvard, and a loan nobody in this family has ever told me about." My mother went very still. My father did not. "That has nothing to do with you," he said. "It has everything to do with me," I said, and I want you to know that my voice did not shake, though every part of me was shaking underneath it. "It's why I got a bike with a bent wheel and Julian got driving lessons. It's why I took out $11,000 in loans and Julian's tuition was quietly paid down for a decade in the background. It's why nobody called me for 6 hours while Mom's heart was stopping, and somebody had the presence of mind to call Aunt Deborah at 5:45. I could hear the library's ventilation system humming overhead, the faint sound of someone returning a stack of books at the front desk, ordinary sounds that felt strangely loud against the silence in that small conference room. My father's hands were folded on the table in front of him, very still, in a way I recognized from every hard conversation of my childhood, the posture he adopted right before he decided whether to fight or to retreat into wounded dignity. My mother's eyes had already gone glassy, though she hadn't looked at the folder yet. Julian had stopped turning his pen. "I'm not asking you to explain the 6 hours today," I went on, before anyone could interrupt. "I already know the 6 hours weren't really about the 6 hours. They were about 30 years of decisions that all point the same direction. I found something that explains a lot of it, and I think you should see it before we talk about anything else." "That's not fair," my mother said quietly. "That's not, Ren, that's not why." "Then tell me why," I said, and I opened the folder in front of her to the page with my grandmother's letter, copied out in my own hand since I couldn't bring myself to give away the original. "Because Grandma Ilsa thought she knew why. She wrote it down 11 years ago. I'd like to hear your version, if it's different." My father was the one who broke first, which surprised me, because I had expected my mother's guilt to crack before his pride did. "You don't understand what those years were like," he said, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice that wasn't performance. "Hell put us in a hole it took a decade to climb out of." I was ashamed. I didn't want my children growing up thinking their father was the kind of man who got fooled that badly. So I decided we were going to be a family that succeeds. That's all I wanted. For us to look like we succeeded. "And I didn't look like success," I said. "It wasn't a question. You never needed us to perform for you," he said, and it landed somewhere between an apology and an accusation. "You were just solid." Julian needed the wins. I thought he needed them more. "I needed things too," I said. "I just didn't make you feel guilty when you didn't give them to me." "That's not the same as not needing them." Julian had been quiet through most of this, turning a pen over in his hands, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't in his own defense. "I didn't know about the loan," he said slowly. "I swear to you, Ren, I didn't know any of that. But I knew I was the one who got called first every time, my whole life. I never asked why. I think," he stopped, started again. "I think I liked being the one who got called. I never once thought about what that meant for you, standing outside the circle. I'm sorry. That's not an excuse. I should have asked why, a long time ago, instead of just enjoying being first. My mother had gone very quiet, flipping slowly through the pages in front of her, stopping on the timeline tab where I'd matched the missed vacation summer to the loan payment spike. I watched her read it twice. I told myself we were being careful, she said finally, not looking up. Frugal. I never let myself think about it as paying for something. I think I needed it to just be who we were, instead of something we were recovering from. You let me believe it was because there wasn't enough, I said. There wasn't enough because of a choice you and Dad made before I was even born, and then you let a 9-year-old carry the weight of a budget she had no part in creating. I know, she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she didn't reach for an explanation to soften it. I know, Ren. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. My father shifted in his chair, and I braced myself for the version of him that argued, the version that had spent 30 years turning every hard conversation into a debate he could win on technicalities. But he surprised me. I used to tell myself Julian needed more because he struggled more, he said slowly. That was true, in a way, he did struggle, with school, with confidence. But I think I told myself that story because it was easier than admitting I gave him more because giving to him made me feel like less of a failure. You never made me feel like a failure, Ren. I think, God help me, I resented that a little. It made it easier to give you less, because you never seemed to need the reassurance the way he did. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the full unraveling of 30 years in a single library conference room, because that isn't how real repair works. The podcasts and the movies want you to believe one honest sentence can undo 3 decades, and it can't. But it was the first true thing my brother had ever said to me about our family's math, and I let it sit in the room for a long moment before I spoke again. I don't want revenge, I told them, and I meant it, though I understood by then that the truth alone, laid out plainly, undeniably, in a folder they each had to physically hold, was its own kind of reckoning. I want you to see it. All of it, the whole pattern, not just the parts that are comfortable. And going forward, I need to be called. Not last. Not as an afterthought. If something happens to either of you, I need you to promise me I'll know within the hour, not within 6. My mother, crying quietly now, nodded. I promise, she said. I should have promised you that a long time ago. I want to be honest about what that meeting didn't fix, because I think stories like this one owe their audience that honesty. My father didn't apologize for Halvard, not directly, he apologized for the shame the debt had caused him, which is a different thing, and I noticed the difference even as I let it go for that day. My mother didn't explain the 6 hours fully. I don't think she ever fully understood it herself, the way people don't always understand the shape of the thing they've been complicit in until it's laid out on a table in someone else's handwriting. Julian's apology was real, I believed that then and I believe it now, but real apologies and real change are 2 different animals, and I knew better than to confuse the arrival of one for the guarantee of the other. I left that library with the folders still on the table. I told them to keep them, that I didn't need to carry the proof around anymore now that they'd each held it themselves, and I drove home to my apartment, the one I'd found during those 11 days, the one that had never once needed me to prove I belonged in it. I didn't move back into contact right away. I gave it 2 more months of mostly silence, occasional short texts, my mother checking in without demanding anything in return, which was, itself, new enough to notice. 8 months after the library meeting, this is where things actually stand, and I want to give you the real version, not the tidy one. My mother calls me now, genuinely calls, not texts that function as a formality, usually on Sundays, and she has, twice, caught herself mid-sentence starting to ask Julian's opinion on something family-related before turning, almost visibly correcting course, and asking mine instead. It's small. It matters anyway. My father and I are polite. We are not close, and I've made peace with the possibility that we may never be, not in the way I once wanted. He sent me a card on my birthday this year, the first one in over a decade that wasn't signed by my mother on his behalf, and inside, in his handwriting, was a single sentence: "I'm trying to see it differently. It's slower than I'd like." I keep that card in a drawer, not because it fixes anything, but because it's proof that he's trying, and proof matters to me. It always has. Julian and I talk more now than we ever did growing up. He asked me, a few months ago, if I'd help him understand our family's actual financial history, not to relitigate anything, he said, but because he realized he'd built his whole adult life on assumptions about our parents' stability that were apparently never true, and he wanted the real numbers instead of the story. I helped him. It felt, oddly, like the first thing we'd ever done together as equals instead of as the favored one and the reliable one. Halvard, for what it's worth, I never contacted. I considered it once, in the early weeks of the investigation, in a moment of anger I'm not proud of. But, when I mentioned it over tea, said something that stuck with me: "You're not in the revenge business, honey. You're in the truth business. Let the truth do its own work on him. It usually does, eventually, one way or another." I let it go. I don't know what happened to him after that, and for the first time in my life, I find I don't need to know. My relationship with Aunt Deborah, oddly, is the one that's changed the least, and I've made a kind of peace with that too. She still calls occasionally, still means well in the general, unspecific way she always has, and I don't think she ever fully understood the significance of the 5:45 call, or that it mattered at all. Not every relationship needs to be renegotiated to be kept. Some of them just settle at whatever depth they were always going to settle at, and I've stopped needing everyone in my orbit to undergo the same reckoning at the same time. There was one uncomfortable dinner, about 4 months after the library meeting, where old habits resurfaced all at once, my mother automatically serving Julian first, my father asking him a string of questions about his job while mine sat unasked, the whole choreography snapping back into place like a rubber band released. Too soon. I didn't make a scene. I noticed it, the way I now notice everything, filed it quietly, and left a little earlier than planned. A week later, my mother called and said, without my prompting, "I noticed what I did at dinner. I'm sorry. I don't think this undoes 30 years of habit in one library meeting. I'm going to keep noticing, though, even when I get it wrong." That call meant more to me than a perfect dinner ever could have. I don't need my family to be flawless now. I need them to notice. I bought a small condo that spring, nothing extravagant, but mine, fully mine, the down payment built entirely from money I'd earned and saved without a single dollar of family help or family debt tangled into it. I painted the second bedroom a soft yellow, the color my grandmother's kitchen had been when I was a child, the one room in that whole tangled family history that had only ever felt safe. Last month, it was my birthday. If you've been paying attention, you already know what that used to mean in my family. The year there wasn't money for a party 3 months after Julian's very funded one, the trophy on the shelf by the guest bathroom where the light didn't reach. Birthdays, in the Voss family, had always been a private ledger of who mattered more that year. This year, my mother asked, 2 weeks in advance, what I wanted to do, genuinely asked, waited for an answer, didn't assume. I told her I wanted something small, at my condo, just family and the 2 people who'd actually shown up for me when it counted. Priya came, of course, bringing a ridiculous, wonderful cake shaped like a spreadsheet, an inside joke only she and I fully understood. Dot came down from her floor with a bottle of good sherry and told stories about her ICU days that made my mother laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. My father came, quiet, a little awkward, and handed me a small box that turned out to contain nothing extravagant, just a photo of me at 9 years old, holding my regional spelling bee trophy, a photo I didn't even know still existed, in a frame he'd clearly picked out himself. "I found it going through some old boxes," he said. "I thought it should be somewhere you could actually see it. Not on a shelf by the bathroom." I didn't cry, not this time. I just looked at that photo, 9-year-old me, gap-toothed, absolutely radiant, holding a trophy that had been hidden away for 20 years, and I set it on the mantel of my own home, in the good light, where it belonged. Julian arrived last, a little late, carrying a gift bag and an apology for the traffic, and when my mother automatically started to ask him to help move chairs before anyone had even sat down, old habit, old choreography, he caught himself mid-motion, looked at me, and said, "Actually, I think Ren gets to just sit at her own birthday party this year. I've got the chairs." It was such a small thing. Nobody else in the room even registered it as significant. But I did. 30 years of small evidence, and finally, one small piece of evidence pointing the other way. We ate cake at my own kitchen table, the yellow of the second bedroom visible down the hallway if you looked, and at some point my mother caught me watching the room, Priya laughing with Dot over something on her phone, my father quietly studying the framed photo on the mantel as if he were seeing his own daughter for the first time, Julian actually washing dishes without being asked, and she came and stood beside me at the counter. "This is a good room," she said simply. "You built a good room, Ren." "I did," I said, and I let myself feel proud of it without immediately deflecting the compliment the way I'd been trained to for 30 years. "I built the whole thing myself." "I know," she said. "I think that's what I'm most sorry about, actually. Not the bike, not the tuition. That you had to learn how to build a good room all on your own, when you shouldn't have had to." I didn't have a tidy response to that, and I didn't try to find one. I just let her stand there beside me for a while, in the good light, while the people I'd chosen and the people I'd been born to filled up the same small kitchen for the first time in longer than either of us could remember, and nobody needed to perform anything for anyone else to feel like they belonged there. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone at the table with the last slice of the spreadsheet-shaped cake and thought about the version of me who'd stood in a hospital doorway 8 months earlier, doing math nobody had asked her to do. She hadn't known yet that the 6 hours would lead her to a birthday card and a box of her grandmother's things, or that a stranger's abandoned debt would end up explaining the entire architecture of her childhood, or that the file she built out of grief and stubbornness would be the thing that finally made her family sit still long enough to listen. She'd only known that something was wrong, and that she was tired of being the only one who could see it. I think that's the part I'd tell her, if I could go back and sit with her on those hospital stairs. Not that it would all work out, I still don't know, some days, how much of it has really worked out, and how much is simply two families, the one I was born into and the one I built, learning to coexist in the same life. I'd tell her that being the one who sees clearly is not a punishment, even when it feels like one. It's the beginning of the only kind of freedom that actually holds. You are allowed to leave a note instead of a speech. I spent years assuming the only way to signal a boundary was through a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop showing up, and let the silence ask the question you're too tired to ask out loud. 6 hours is a decision, not an accident. Dot taught me that, and it applies far beyond hospitals. When the people who love you consistently forget you until last, the forgetting is information. Believe the pattern before you believe the excuse. A lifetime of small evidence adds up to a verdict, even if no single piece would win in court. The bike with the bent wheel didn't matter on its own. It mattered stacked next to 11 other moments just like it. Don't let anyone tell you that you're making something out of nothing when the nothing has a 30-year paper trail. The people who show up without being asked are the real family, whatever the paperwork says. Priya with her grocery bag, with her tea and her 31 years of hard-won bluntness, I built a new definition of family out of people who chose me, and I don't regret for 1 second that it looks different from the one I was born into. Understanding why doesn't require forgiving what. My grandmother's letter gave me the why, the shame, the debt, the desperate need for a success story. It didn't erase what that why had cost me. You're allowed to hold both truths without letting one cancel out the other. Bring the evidence, not the anger, into the room. I didn't yell in that library. I didn't need to. 42 pages of undeniable fact did more work in one afternoon than 30 years of unspoken hurt ever could have. Facts are patient. Let them do the talking. Repair is slow, uneven, and never guaranteed, and it's still worth leaving the door open a crack. My father's card didn't fix anything by itself. Julian moving the chairs didn't erase the driving lessons. But I've learned that real change usually looks like small, awkward corrections in real time, not grand gestures. Watch for the small corrections. They're the ones that are actually true. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to build your own proof of a truth nobody else wanted to say out loud, tell me about it in the comments. And if you're new here, welcome, hit subscribe, because the quiet ones have a lot more stories left to tell.